The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody. My name is David Simpson. I work for Themis Education, and we do classes on all kinds of IT topics. One of our specialties is DB2 training. So the topic of today's webinar is some things that you can expect from DB2 11 for ZOS. And you have my email address there on the board. You can feel free to make use of that if you have questions or thoughts that come up during or after this webinar. I would love to hear from you about the questions you have and as you go through your own version 11 migration. So the topics that we've got today come out of a class that we teach. It's a 3-day class on the version 11 migration and new features. And so we're going to be doing a very abbreviated version of that. If you would like to download the slides for this webinar, and eventually the playback of this will be available at the website at the bottom there. So themisinc.com/webinars. You can feel free to go there and you'll see the playback for this and several other webinars, as well as announcements for upcoming webinars that you can register for. We try and do one of these a month. So feel free to make use of that. You can also follow us on Twitter at Themis Training, and you'll see announcements for the webinars and many other things. So the class that this material comes from is a 3-day class called version 11, DB2 version 11 for ZOS, what administrators need to know. If you download the slide deck for this, there's a couple of hyperlinks there. Number one is the description of that class, and also a link to register for the one that we have coming up on August 19th. So if this stuff is just truly interesting to you and you want to know a lot more, that's a full 3-day seminar. You can register for it as a virtual class, and we'll do a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today in a lot more detail, as well as with hands-on workshops and such. So I'd love to invite you to our website to see that. Okay, so the agenda that we have for today, we're going to take an overview of this new release of DB2. We're going to talk about some migration considerations, and then some enhancements that we feel like you're going to be able to use very soon. In fact, some of these enhancements are actually will actually assist you in surviving the migration and being able to come up on the new release with very few issues. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start off with just an overview of what DB2 11 is, and we have some features for everybody in this new release. So we'll start off by looking at the system side. On the system side, we have tighter integration with the Z architecture. The way it uses CPU and memory. We get more use of the zips, particularly for background tasks, and we're going to talk about one of those in particular in a little bit of detail later in the webinar, and that is the automated index cleanup. Okay. Eventually we're really hoping to have cost savings with this new release. So version 8, back about 10 years ago, when you went to version 8, it actually cost you something probably in CPU. In other words, version 8 used more CPU than its predecessors for a variety of reasons. And every release since then, we've been getting some of that back. And version 11 takes a fairly significant step forward. Some of the cost savings that you get will be kind of out of the box as soon as you migrate. Some of them are going to require a rebind, and then some of them are going to actually require coding changes. So IBM in the last few releases has been pushing it toward the front end of that. In other words, we get quite a lot out of the box. We get quite a bit if we're willing and able to simply take a rebind. Okay, and we have higher limitations in the new release due to the way memory is used and such. On the DBA side, a variety of things are accomplished with this release. Number one, we hopefully have a reduced need for reorg, and we're going to talk about why that is, again, with that automated index cleanup in a little bit. The online schema change that we got delivered in version 10 is expanded in version 11, and we also get a little bit of relief on the reorg that we're required to do to materialize those things. Okay, so lots of help with schema change. That's been a focus for DB2 for the last several releases. We also have features in there that'll help us be able to break into processes that are hanging on to our data for things like DDL and binds and rebinds. Even if those packages are bound with release deallocate, they've got some features in there that'll allow us to allow those things to let go of the things that we're trying to work on. Okay, so lots of stuff for DBAs. For developers and applications, we have this new object called a global variable, which, if you're familiar with global temporary tables, works very similar, except it's just a variable, not a whole table. So you can create a variable, assign a value to it, a SQL variable, and then that variable persists as you call other parts of your application, whether it's stored procedures or other pieces of your application. Another big feature that we get in version 11 on the application side is this array data type that is used with the native stored procedures. So one of the problems with native stored procedures, and one of the common complaints I got, said that SQL PL language did not allow for repeating fields or an array. We now get that with a data type that can be turned into an array. So another big feature here is that you can make version 11 from a SQL perspective be compatible with version 10. This should help us with the migration. We're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail momentarily here. We also have stuff in SQL, the cube rollup and grouping sets. That's really the last piece of functionality from a SQL perspective that was on other platforms but not in DB2 ZOS, and we get that in version 11. Also XML, always a growing and changing feature. On the prerequisites, you've got to start with DB2 version 10, so there's no skip level migration. You got to be ZOS 1.13. Most of you are fine on that front. Those go back a few years now. If you're data sharing, you've got some minimums on the coupling facility for both toleration and if you want to exploit DB2 version 11 features. Probably the biggest one on here is the client. That's the piece of the environment that is the most difficult to get your arms around, because that client is spread out on lots of different application servers and people's workstations. The new rule is that they'll tolerate any supported version of DB2 will tolerate any supported version of the client. That's where they're trying to get. So from a practical perspective, for version 11, that means you got to be on the client side at least 9.7 FixPack 6, or if you're 10.1 FixPack 2 if you want toleration, and 10.5 FixPack 2 if you want to exploit. So particular things like that native SQL procedure array data type, the older clients aren't going to support that. So if you want to use that in your stored procedure calls that come through the client, particularly if you have parameters that are repeating or array data types, then you're going to have to be at least 10.5 FixPack 2 on your client and any DB2 Connect that sits between you and the backend DB2. Okay, so we've got other minimums for Data Studio and Enterprise COBOL. One of the big things is third-party products for any release, and in this one in particular, things that touch the log really need to be very current for toleration even of the new RBA, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Okay, so that's the deal on the prerequisites. Some other considerations. Word on the street is DB2 is going to use a little bit more real storage than previous releases. We've got bigger control structures. We also potentially have the capability to do more release deallocate with the break-in that I spoke of a little bit earlier. So that means DB2, if you do bind more things with release deallocate, it's going to be holding on to things longer, which could require more real storage. The trade-off there is we hope for better performance on the other side of that. As I mentioned a minute ago, any tools that touch the DB2 log really do need to be ready before you go to conversion mode. This is kind of a common misconception. This extended RBA LRSN that we're going to talk about in a little bit, you don't actually convert to that until you're in new function mode. And then once you're in new function mode, you can do it at your own discretion. However, your tooling needs to be ready for that bigger RBA LRSN even in conversion mode, even before you've done that conversion. The reason is that DB2 starts talking in bigger RBAs from the moment you go to conversion mode. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like in just a little bit. Okay. As with the last several releases, we've got a multi-phase migration going on. Got a lot of animation here. You know, we're going to start off on the left side there in version 10, new function mode. We're going to migrate forward. We're going to be in a place called conversion mode. Right? In conversion mode, we don't really get to use the new features yet, not many of them anyway. And in conversion mode, you do have the capability to fall back to version 10. This ENFM, or enabling new function mode process, is a series of reorgs of the catalog that's going to get your catalog ready for use of the new features. The catalog actually gets touched twice in the migration process. Some of it happens in the conversion mode, and some of it happens in new function mode. Okay. The rule of thumb here is, and if you look at the actual next slide, the rule of thumb here is that when you migrate to conversion mode, any new columns or new tables that are going to be added to the catalog are going to happen in the catmate process, which is the job DSNTIJF. That's the sample job the system programmer runs to migrate you to conversion mode. Anything new in the catalog, new columns, new tables will be added there. And then existing tables that need to change somehow. In other words, the big one here in version 11 is every place in the catalog that references an RBA LRSN needs to expand. That stuff happens in the ENFM process with a series of reorgs to your catalog. Okay, so JTC gets you to conversion mode, and then you'll stay there and do your testing. At some point, you're going to then migrate forward to this enabling new function mode and then ultimately new function mode. The new function mode job is just a very quick, you know, throws a switch essentially, and you're able to use the new features. These modes at the bottom there, CM asterisk and ENFM asterisk, those are for fallback. So if you migrate out of conversion mode into ENFM and then you decide there's a problem and you need to fall back, you can fall back to conversion mode asterisk. And the deal there is, you know, you're running through a similar code path that you were in conversion mode. The little asterisk there means you're not really back in conversion mode. In other words, I can no longer fall back to version 10 once you've moved forward from conversion mode the first time. But it does give you something to put on your change control form that says, you know, we have a back out plan, right, as you move forward. Okay, ENFM asterisk is a very similar thing. It means you've been further forward and you've fallen back. As a practical matter, hardly anyone, no one I've talked to has ever used these modes for real. Lots of people have practiced getting there in a sandbox. But really, once you've survived the migration to conversion mode, you know, you've really taken on the biggest amount of change. Okay, so you know how long you stay in each of these modes is really a shop-specific decision. It depends on how much data you've got. It depends on the size of your catalog for going to ENFM. You know, what's your tolerance for risk, and how long it takes you to kind of run through everything in a testing environment to make sure everything's going to work, going to stick. One thing that makes this release a little bit different than previous releases is that when you get to new function mode, you're not necessarily done. And what I mean by that is, you know, in the past, when we've gotten a new function mode, we kind of had the party and we called it done, right? We called the migration done. In version 11, there's some tasks that you could say are still associated with the migration that really need to be done after you get to new function mode. And we're going to talk about a few of these. Apple Compat is one of them. Apple Compat is a new feature that is trying to allow us to protect our applications from changes in behavior with the new release. Okay, so that we can actually kind of pretend from an application perspective that we're still on version 10 and have SQL behave the way it was on version 10. Okay, but at some point we are going to want to go ahead and take on the new behavior. So that's a kind of a migration related task that you got to think about after the migration is completed. Our dynamic SQL applications like Spoofy and such, there is a sample job that will rebind those with Apple Compat set to version 11. But by default, when you get to new function mode, you're still pretending you're on 10. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. Also, we've got things to think about like the RBA LRSN migration. And there's a couple of ZPARMs there, object create format and utility object conversion, that you're probably going to want to set when you come up with a timetable for how you're going to do that migration. Okay. You also have to deal with all your then application incompatibilities when you set Apple Compat to v11r1, and there's an if kit that'll help you trace the things that are likely to change or possibly will change when you take on that new behavior. So let's let that transition us into these migration considerations then. And the first one of those we're going to talk about is access path stability. So this is a set of features that really started back in version 9, really exploded in version 10, and then we have a couple of tweaks to it in version 11. I find a lot of people using a bind option here called AP reuse. This came out in version 10. And if you do a rebind with AP reuse set to error, okay, when you do a bind or rebind, what you're asking for is for DB2 to please use the access paths from the previous version or the previous bind or rebind, if that's possible. And AP reuse error says if that's not possible, if DB2 just can't use the access path that it was using before, then please fail the bind. I find lots of people using that one, and lots of people use that to help them get to version 10. So in other words, when you migrate forward and you want to, for performance reasons, get reorg or rebind all of your packages or a big chunk of your packages, then we also maybe want some stability there. In other words, I don't want the access paths changing on me all at once. Some of those changes are going to be good, some of those changes are going to be not so good. And so you can rebind with AP reuse error, and that says please force the use of the old access paths unless that's just not possible, and then fail the bind. The new option we get in version 11 is AP reuse warn. AP reuse warn says please try and force the reuse of old access paths, and when it's not possible, go ahead and generate a new one and throw a warning. So that means you're going to get more of your packages to rebind this way, really theoretically all of them, and you're going to get some warnings that says, hey, here are the statements that I just could not force the use of the old access path. Right, so if you have 100 statements in a package and one of them can't be forced to use the old access path, then the warn really comes in handy because the other 99 will continue to use their old access path. We won't fail the whole package just because there's one of them. One of them is failing. Okay. So that's going to really come in handy when we get to another feature here with optimization, and that is we're going to get more stage 1 predicates. Now, really, this is not a feature of optimization, it's a feature of query transformation, meaning as your SQL is getting kind of broken down before it goes into optimization, some of these predicates are going to get rewritten. For example, that second one there, substring of a column 1, n, DB2 is going to actually rewrite that as a between. Okay, so that right now is a stage 2 non-indexable predicate in version 10. Version 11, it might become a stage 1 indexable predicate if Optimizer can rewrite it. So here's another example when I say where date of a timestamp is equal to a particular value, what I'm saying there is what I've been asking people to do in their SQL is to write that as a between. Right? DB2 deals with the second, the order timestamp between basically January 1st at midnight and January 1st at the other midnight, right? 24:00. That's midnight the next morning essentially. If I can get you to write it that way, then that is a stage 1 indexable predicate, where the date of a timestamp is a stage 2 predicate. So in version 11, query transformation comes along and rewrites that, rewrites it for you. Okay, so things that you wrote that were stage 2 non-indexable predicates become stage 1 indexable. So this can be kind of a bad thing for you if you're using AP reuse error. In other words, you're saying force the use of the old access path. I had a non-indexable predicate there, so DB2 may not have been able to match that column in the index, or it may not have been able to use the index on that column at all. AP reuse warn that we looked at a moment ago, there's one caveat or one exception to that. AP reuse warn, if it sees that your access path is changing by just a little bit, in other words, the index that you're using is the same as before, but in the new access path you would be able to match more columns, then it goes ahead and allows that change, assuming that that is kind of unequivocally good. Okay, so that's another advantage for this AP reuse warn, is that it's going to allow some access path change that really can't possibly be bad. Okay. However, it won't if DB2 could use a different index now that you have your predicates as stage 1. It's not going to pick up that different index if you use AP reuse. So at some point, these access path stability options, they provide stability, right? Stability is good when it prevents bad things from happening. Stability is bad when it prevents good things from happening. So it's a good way to kind of get yourself through the migration in a stable way, but at some point you probably do want to go back and figure out what wants to change, and that other bind option there, AP Compare, can help you with that. Okay. All right, and kind of a companion feature to this is this new application compatibility thing. Application compatibility. So access path stability deals with allowing access paths to change. That's a performance kind of thing. Application compatibility deals with, are we going to allow the behavior of the SQL to change? In other words, what it returns. And this is a new set of features in version 11 that allow you to have some control over that. Okay, so Apple Compat is both a subsystem parameter, a zparm, and a bind parameter. And really what it amounts to is that the subsystem parameter controls the default for the bind. Okay. Now for dynamic SQL, you also have this special register called current application compatibility, which controls the behavior in a dynamic SQL world. That's going to default to whatever the package that this dynamic SQL is running under is bound with. There are two current allowable values, v10r1 and v11r1. When you migrate forward from version 10, all of your packages are going to come forward with v10r1 as their value for this parameter. And you're in conversion mode, you can only bind with Apple Compat v10r1. In other words, from a behavioral perspective on SQL, we're pretending that we're still on version 10. So the SQL statements in my programs should only return exactly the same thing that they returned on version 10. The behavior, any incompatibilities should not show themselves while I have it still bound with v10r1. If I want to use new features, new SQL features, I'm going to have to bind with v11r1 at some point, and I can only do that once I'm on new function mode. Okay. When I'm on new function mode, I can still continue to pretend that I'm on version 10. So I can keep binding with v10r1 even when I'm in new function mode. Let's keep pretending for this application that we're on version 10. The only thing that'll force me to move forward is if I want to make use of some of the new features. Okay. So this allows you to deal with your incompatibilities after the migration instead of before, or at the moment of migration. You are going to eventually have to deal with them. So on the next slide, the system parameter controls the default for the bind. You have V10R1 and V11R1 as your options. Okay. If you use V10R1, then you're compatible with version 10, but you're not going to be able to migrate. You're not going to be able to take advantage of the new features. Future releases of DB2, they're telling us will allow for 2 levels back. So you have 2 releases to get rid of your incompatibilities. So theoretically, if the next release of DB2 is called version 12, version 10 would still be allowed as an option. But when you go to the next one beyond that, then version 10 support's going to go away. So you have a couple of releases to get rid of your version 10 or incompatibilities. Okay. In version 11, there just aren't actually that many of these incompatibilities, it turns out. But we've got some nice infrastructure here going forward that'll prevent us from having to address every application incompatibility at the moment we migrate. So you've got time to allow that to go forward. Okay. Now we're going to take a look at some of the enhancements that we think are going to be pretty useful in the near term or fairly soon in your version 11 migration. The first one of those, and the one that I'm finding is driving a lot of people to version 11 in the early, is this new RBA or extended RBA and LRSN. So when in your DB2 logs, DB2 tracks log entries by address, right? By a relative byte address from the beginning, since the beginning of your DB2 subsystem. Each of these, the LRSN kind of coordinates the different logs in a data sharing environment. So if you're data sharing, every member has its own logs, and the LRSN is synchronizing or providing sequencing of those log entries on the different members of the group. Each of these right now is 6 bytes in version 10 and prior. Okay, so that allows for up to 256 terabytes of log over the life of a subsystem. If you ever kind of get to the end of the log, or the log, if you run out of log addresses, then you've got some work to do, right? If you're data sharing and it's not that hard, you basically retire that member and put up another one. If you are not data sharing, then you have to reset, do a cold start of DB2, setting the RBA back to a much smaller number, and then all of your recovery information is bad. And there's a process that IBM's got documented for you to do that, but it does require an extended outage. So beginning in version 11, they're allowing for us to have a bigger RBA, goes up from 6 to 10 bytes. LRSN, by the way, is based on the clock, and it runs out in 2042, the year 2042, unless you've got a delta, depending on how you went to data sharing, you could actually run out before then. So we have kind of a Y2K problem with DB2 in the year 2042, unless we get to this extended RBA LRSN. So basically we're expanding from 6 bytes to 10. The problem is that these things are everywhere. Right? There's 6-byte RBAs littered throughout your entire DB2 subsystem under the covers. So a lot has to be addressed under the covers for this to be able to become effective. So, version 11 allows for the 10-byte RBA LRSN. Conversion requires updates to your bootstrap, to your catalog, and then every application table space and index. Okay. This conversion can be done at your discretion. You don't have to do it right away. If you're not close to the end, then you might not, make this a high priority. But you really want it to be done before you run out of 6-byte RBAs. So this is, several of my clients have really kind of moved to version 11 quickly so that they didn't have to go through this cold start or cycling of members in a data sharing group another time. So. You want to get this done probably before, especially on a standalone DB2, before you exhaust that 6-byte RBA. Okay. In DB2 version 11, even in conversion mode, the messaging and instrumentation start speaking these 10-byte RBAs right away, even if you haven't done all the steps to the conversion yet. So you see right there in my, this is just, I'm starting up DB2, or I think we've done an archive log there. So this is in master. And every time an archive log gets cut, it shows you, starting and ending RBA for that log file. You can see there, I'm already seeing 10-byte RBAs on my conversion mode system. Even though I haven't done the conversion yet, I'm not even in new function mode where I'm able to do this new conversion to the expanded RBA. But DB2 is already talking 10-byte RBAs internally. This is true for all the instrumentation as well. So your log tools and your replication tools that read the DB2 log, they got to be ready to deal with this extended RBA LRSN right away as soon as you go into conversion mode, even if you don't plan to do the actual conversion for quite some time. Okay, so this is how it works. This is the format of the new RBA LRSN. So the RBA, we actually just left pad with zeros. In other words, we've got a bigger RBA. So we've got room for a lot more log now. For the LRSN, we have 4 bytes of additional room to work with, right? When we expand, they only stuck 1 byte at the beginning. And that gives you another 30,000 years of LRSN. So we didn't need any more bytes at the beginning of the LRSN. One of them gives us 30,000 years. The goal always is to push the problem to beyond when I retire, and I think we've accomplished that there, right? On the LRSN, they've taken the other 3 bytes and put them on the right side. And what that means is the LRSN now has more precision. So for those of you in a data sharing environment, you're probably familiar with this problem called LRSN spin, and that occurs when 2 transactions require a unique LRSN, and they both get in there and the clock says the same thing. One of them actually spins, just kind of waiting for the clock to advance before getting that actual RBA. That's actual CPU that's consumed waiting for the clock to move on. Well, now the clock is moving much, much faster because we have a lot more precision on the right-hand side of that LRSN. So they've solved a couple of problems at the same time here with this extended RBA LRSN. So how do we get there? Well, the bootstrap has RBAs all over it, right? The catalog and directory, their recovery information, really every header page of every table space and index in your environment has RBAs on it. So, and that includes the catalog and directory. So we have really 3 steps to this process. You got to convert the bootstrap. DB2's got to be down for that, but it's very quick. You have to convert the catalog and directory, its recovery information, to the extended RBA LRSN, and then every application table space has to be reorged with a control card that will convert it to the extended RBA LRSN. Okay, so that it's a fairly involved process. It's not rocket science, but when you have to touch every object, that can present a challenge to a larger environment. You can actually do these in any order that you want. Okay, there are some consequences for doing them in a different order than IBM recommends, but you don't have to do the bootstrap first and then the catalog and then the application table spaces. Okay. And in the 3-day version of this class, we talk about this in quite a bit of detail. Okay, but this is something you're going to have to plan for after your migration is complete, but could save you quite a bit of headache down the road as you start exhausting the 256 terabytes of log that were allowed. Okay, another new feature in version 11 is kind of an extension of what we got in version 10 with the online schema change. Okay, so version 10 gave you the ability to do alters that we couldn't do before, right? Alter, things on a table space or a table that we couldn't do before, and they introduced the concept of a pending change. So probably the most common example of this is, migrating from a simple or segmented table space to a universal partition by growth table space. We could never change table space type before. Now we can, and when we do that, DB2 throws you into advisory reorg pending and says, okay, this change will really happen when you accomplish an online reorg of that object. Other things we could change in version 10, the page size, the DS size, the segment size of a PB, of universal table space, the member cluster attribute, the page size of a buffer of an index. Those kind of things were never online changes before. Most of them involve dropping and recreating the object. Okay, so when you do the alter in version 10 on one of these things, it actually just kind of records the change as something that's going to happen in the catalog, and then you have to run a reorg to actually accomplish that change. Okay, so a lot of shops have been making use of this particularly to migrate their older kinds of table spaces to universal table spaces. In version 11, we get really two new features that become deferred changes. Number one, the ability to remove a column. So you can now actually alter table, drop a column. The column doesn't go away right away, but it'll go into that advisory reorg pending thing, and then when you accomplish an online reorg, the column will disappear. Another thing that happens is altering of limit keys for the newer kinds of table spaces, really everything except the old index-controlled partitioning. If you alter limit keys now, that will become a deferred change. We've been able to alter limit keys in the past, but when I do an alter to a limit key, say on version 10, it takes the affected partitions and puts them in reorg pending, not advisory reorg pending, but like you have to accomplish a reorg to make this change come about, and you are going to be unavailable on those partitions until you accomplish that reorg. Now it places you in version 11 in advisory reorg pending, and with advisory reorg pending, then you get to decide when you're actually going to do the reorg that makes that take effect, and it's an online reorg so that your outage should be fairly limited, really to the switch phase of that online reorg. Another thing that we get in version 11 that'll help us accomplish that online schema change a little bit easier is a control card on the reorg. Sort data no, recluster no. I call this the reorg that doesn't reorg. Right, so if I say sort data no, recluster no, the reorg is going to unload the data in whatever sequence it is in the table. It's not going to sort it, and it's going to reload it into the table in the same sequence that it pulled it out. So this is the reorg that doesn't reorg. I'm going to use this in the situation where I'm reorging to accomplish one of these schema changes. I'm not reorging for a performance reason, and I don't want to have to figure out how to get enough sort space and everything to be able to unload and sort and reload the data. This is particularly helpful because I'm not able for most of these schema changes to do the reorgs at the partition level. So when you do a table space migration from, like, let's say universal partition by, or from classic partitioning to universal partition by range, you have to reorg the entire thing, not the parts, but the whole table space in one step. And that could require quite a bit of sorting. Sort data no, recluster no says don't do the sorting, just unload and put it back in the same order that you unloaded it. Now it still may have to sort for indexes, right? That's going to happen still, but the big sort for the actual data on the table is going to be avoided here. Okay. Another new feature in version 11 is this automated index cleanup. So indexes are full of these pseudo deleted entries. When we do a delete from the table, DB2 doesn't actually go pluck the entry out of the index. It marks it as deleted, because actually removing it could cause quite a bit of work to have to go on the page, the index leaf page. So it marks them as deleted and leaves them there. So over time, you can have quite a bit of your index taken up with these pseudo deleted entries that are taking up space on leaf pages, which may mean your index has more levels in it than it needs. And the only way this has been cleaned up historically is with a reorg. So reorg of the index. Version 11 throws these automated index cleanup tasks out there. So there's a CPARM that controls it called index cleanup threads. The default is 10, and the best wisdom coming out of IBM says we leave it set at 10. Now, the way you could disable this feature if you're scared of it or if you have a problem with it is by setting index cleanup threads to 0. Okay. But the default of 10 is good if you want to let this happen. And what this says is there's going to be 10 threads background tasks running in DB2 that are using real-time stats to go look for indexes that have a lot of these pseudo-deleted entries and clean them up. So this is where we're hoping for a reduced need for reorg of these indexes. And if you have your reorg process automated using real-time stats to determine what needs to be reorged, hopefully you'll see less of these indexes come up once you're on version 11 and allowing this to happen. We do have a catalog table called sysindex cleanup that will allow you to give some control over this feature. In other words, if you have certain tables that you don't want this to happen to, or certain indexes, you can put entries in this catalog table that will disable that. Or if you have certain periods of time in your day that you don't want it, if you don't want it to happen at noon, you could take the heart of your business day and exclude that. You can either wildcard it for all objects, or have specific indexes that you that you want to limit this. So there's a lot of flexibility built into this feature to turn it off or to limit when it happens and on which objects it happens. And the goal is, again, to reduce the need for routine reorgs of index objects. On the application side, we already talked about some of these in overview. We get global variables. We get extended SQL support for grouping sets, roll up, and cube. We get the arrays and the stored procedures. Another one that we haven't talked about much is this automatic archiving. This is kind of an extension to the temporal data that we got in DB2 version 10. Automatic archiving says that we can have DB2 automatically take rows that we delete out of one table and put them in an archive table. And then from an SQL perspective, when you query your base table, you can, with some global variables, control whether or not we're looking at just the base table or also including the archive. So the idea here is we try and pare down the base table to what's the minimum amount of data that's needed for the online transactional system to run, but we've still got the archive over here that contains the data that we've deleted or purged out of the operational system. And we can query them both together if we want by setting some bind parameters and some global variable values. Okay. The last few pages of the presentation have kind of a list of some of the new ZPARMs that we think are important for you to be evaluating as you go to the new release. Clearly, Apple Compat is something you're going to have to look at after you're in new function mode. We talked about that V10R1 or V11R1. The object create format and utility object conversion, that deals with the RBA LRSN conversion. Object create format says when I build new objects, once I'm in new function mode, when I create new table spaces, do I want them to be basic RBA, the smaller one, or extended RBA, the bigger one? Utility object conversion says when I do reorgs, by default, what happens? Do I convert it to extended? Do I convert it back to basic? Or do I leave things the way they are? That would be none. No basic is a special option. You'll do that toward the end of your conversion where you're saying, I'm not allowing people to go back to the basic format anymore. Okay. Reorg drop PBG parts. This is an interesting one that says when I reorg a partition by growth table space, do I want to purge out any unused partitions? So if I have 5 partitions for my PBG and I reorg it and the data all fits into 3 now because we've deleted or something, what do I do with those 2 empty ones? Historically, the 2 empty ones have just stayed there. I can now say, set this to enable, reorg drop PBG parts to enable, and that says, go ahead and prune off all the partitions that don't have anything in it after one of those reorgs. The cost of that is I can't recover back to a point in time before that reorg because those parts are not there anymore. Okay. So that's an interesting one that you might want to talk about as well. We just talked about the index cleanup threads as something you might want to give some thought into whether you want that to happen or not, at least initially. So that is the presentation for today. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to use my email address. If you have any questions or comments on the content of this webinar or anything else DB2 really, you can also visit themisinc.com/webinars. That There you will find a download for the slides of this webinar, as well as in a few days we'll have the playback out there so you can share it with others. You'll also see the playback and slides from some previous webinars that we've done, as well as links to sign up for the upcoming webinars. That's a decent page to revisit every once in a while and see what's coming up. And keep in touch with us that way. Again, please do feel free to make use of the email address if you have any questions or comments going forward. And thanks for your participation today. Look forward to talking to some of you in the future.